This is our home. According to our oral tradition, we have lived with the Great Lakes for thousands and thousands of years. It has been a world of abundance, waters teeming with fish, virgin forests filled with wildlife, lakes thick with wild rice. We have lived close to nature, and Mother Earth has been generous, supplying us with food, medicine, shelter, and clothing, and providing us with transportation, art, and spiritual fulfillment. We honor and respect the land and its creatures as life-givers, and so pray for the eagle's vision to protect and preserve these things upon which we humbly rely. We are the Ojibwe people. Treaties. Treaty rights. Tribal sovereignty. What do these terms mean to Indian people today? What do they mean to other Americans? The treaty right to hunt, fish, and gather on ceded lands is a right reserved by forefathers of the Ojibwe people for the benefit of generations to come. When they sold large tracts of land to the United States government through treaties, they kept for themselves and their descendants the right to continue the traditional lifeways that have sustained them for generations. These are lifeways which cut deeply into the spirituality and culture of the Ojibwe people. The Ojibwe traditionally moved with the cycle of seasons to harvest what was needed for shelter and sustenance. They took with humility and a continuing respect for nature. Harvest was, and still is, often accompanied with a gift of asema in respect to the life that is being taken.
All life must be honored. The quality of life for one order depends upon another. Take life, but not in anger. Life for one means death for another. By honoring death, life itself is honored.
Today, treaty rights guarantee the Ojibwe the continued right to gather maple sugar in the spring, birch bark in the early summer, plants and herbs used for medicines, food, and ceremonies, berries and wild rice in the fall. They guarantee access to fish and game relied on for food and also central to feasts and Ojibwe ceremonies.
Rice is one of the 4 sacred foods that we'll use in the lodge during the ceremonies. There's 4 sacred foods, and wild rice is one of them, along with venison and corn and berries.
In many of the cultural practices, we use pelts, feathers, and objects like that that are of religious significance. And that is a part of what I would call subsistence. That's a part of what contributes to our existence, which contributes to our unique nature, our unique perspective on things. And that's the things that we need to protect and are protected through agreements that were reached in treaties made a long time ago, more than 150 years ago, by very forward-looking leaders, looking out for the, as we like to say, 7 generations into the future, looking out for their needs.
As we begin the 21st century, the traditions of the Ojibwe people remain as important to them as they did in the 19th century when the treaties were made. Ojibwe leaders still plan for the benefit of those who will walk the earth 7 generations from now, as did their forefathers. They continue to give thanks to the Creator for providing for their needs, and thanks to Akif, Mother Earth, for her bounty. The Ojibwe also recognize their role as keepers of the earth, and that it is necessary to protect the earth, the air, the water, and all living beings to assure today's opportunities will be available for the 7th generation. For this reason, off-reservation treaty harvests are regulated and limited in scope, and the Ojibwe bands are actively involved in managing the resources upon which they and all people rely. This is the role of the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, which represents 11 Ojibwe bands in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, all bands which were signatories to treaties reserving hunting, fishing, and gathering rights on ceded lands. The commission, known commonly as GLIFWC, assists its member bands in implementing a meaningful exercise of off-reservation harvests while also protecting the resources from harm. At the time the treaties were signed in the mid-1800s, people could not envision the complex society in which we live today, nor the tremendous strain on the natural resources due to population growth and industry. As settlers pushed into the territories now known as Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, they wanted the land primarily for timber and mining purposes, resources needed to accommodate the needs of a rapidly growing country, and the resources seemed endless. The United States government dealt with the Ojibwe as sovereign nations. Sovereignty refers to the powers of self-determination and self-regulation. Consequently, the United States acquired the land in northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota through a series of government-to-government agreements with the Ojibwe called treaties. The treaties define the tracts of land sold as well as the payment in dollars and services due the Ojibwe. In many of these treaties, the Ojibwe explicitly reserved the right to hunt, fish, and gather on the lands they sold.
Treaty rights is really kind of a misnomer. It's a common term, but tribes always had the rights that they enjoy today, and they just never gave those away. And so those have come to be known as treaty rights, but they're really what we call reserved rights, rights that tribes have always had, and they've never given them up.
I look at treaty rights as something that was not given to us, but it's something that has always been there. It's a right that's an inherent right, not a right that was given to us by the federal government or by the state government or by the Supreme Court, but it was given to us through our association with the land and with the area.
One of the first treaties with the Lake Superior Chippewa was in 1825. This treaty established boundaries for the homeland of the Lake Superior Chippewa, which included northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. As time passed and advancing settlement needed Ojibwe lands for their timber and mineral resources, other treaties were negotiated between the United States and the Ojibwe. In 1836 and 1837, the Ojibwe signed treaties selling land in Michigan and Wisconsin. In an 1842 treaty, they ceded their remaining land in northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And finally, in the Treaty of 1854, the last of the Ojibwe's land in northern Minnesota was ceded. The 1854 treaty also established permanent reservations for many of the Ojibwe bands. Following the treaties between the United States and the Ojibwe, the territories of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota achieved statehood, with their boundaries cutting through treaty boundaries in some cases. As time progressed, the states passed laws which ignored the treaty-reserved rights of the Ojibwe. Band members who hunted, fished, or gathered on ceded lands without a state license were often prosecuted, fined, and in some cases, their equipment was confiscated. However, recent federal court rulings have reaffirmed the treaty rights of the Ojibwe. In the 1970s, several U.S. Supreme Court rulings upheld tribal commercial fishing rights in Lake Superior and in the Northwest. In 1983, the Voigt decision was upheld by the U.S. Court of Appeals, reaffirming Ojibwe treaty rights in Wisconsin ceded territories. And most recently, in March of 1999, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the Mille Lacs decision, which verified Ojibwe treaty rights in the Minnesota ceded territory under the 1837 treaty. Treaty rights are sometimes looked upon as a usufructuary right, or the right to use. A similar example would be when a landowner sells waterfront property, but retains the right to have recreational access to the water. This also is a reserved usufructuary right. Treaty rights are limited in scope, meaning the tribes do not have the right to take all of the resources. They are self-regulated by the Ojibwe bands. The states have the power to regulate only for public health and safety and conservation concerns. The Ojibwe bands regulate off-reservation treaty harvests through tribal laws. The goal is to provide a meaningful opportunity for tribal members to harvest the resources while protecting the resource from depletion or harm. In 1984, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, GLIFWC, was formed to serve as an intertribal resource management agency on behalf of its 11-member Ojibwe bands. Member bands include the Minnesota Ojibwe bands of Fond du Lac and Mille Lacs, the Wisconsin bands of Red Cliff, Bad River, St. Croix, La Coudray, Lac du Flambeau, and Mole Lake, and the Michigan Ojibwe communities of Bay Mills, Keweenaw Bay, and Lac Vieux Desert. Representatives from all these bands signed treaties reserving hunting, fishing, and gathering rights for their descendants.
And the off-reservation rights retained are joint rights. They're held by all of the tribes. They're not exclusively the one tribe. And as a result, an organization, a commission, is a good way to set up a management, enforcement, and enhancement program for these resources.
I consider us one tribe, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa Nation. I consider us bands. And that's the best thing about what I like about GLIFWC is the fact that it brings all the bands back together with one voice. To me, GLIFWC is the solidifying of our nation, and that's why I'm one of the biggest supporters of GLIFWC. Gets us all together.
I think the unity is the thing that's the most important. You know, if we unify as a tribe and we work together, I think we can solve a lot of problems that, you know, the larger society in general can't solve for us. We've got to solve them ourselves.
GLIFWC is directed by the Board of Commissioners, a policy-making body with a representative from each member band. Standing committees make recommendations to the board. For example, the Voight Intertribal Task Force deals with inland hunting, fishing, and gathering activities on ceded lands, and the Lakes Committee makes recommendations regarding the Lake Superior commercial fishery. It is up to the Commission staff to implement directives from the board. Besides administrative staff, the Commission has 5 divisions. The Biological Services Division, staffed by biologists and skilled technicians, works in diverse areas of resource management, including inland fisheries, the Lake Superior fishery, waterfowl, wildlife, wild plants, forestry, and environmental science. A primary task of the Biological Services staff has been to accrue a solid database on each species of interest to member bands. Consequently, seasonal assessments are performed to acquire population information along with other data related to the growth rate and condition of specific species. Much of this information is exchanged with state biologists in order to cooperatively make well-informed management decisions.
So they basically cover the area that we don't. Together, all this information gives us a real good idea of the fish community throughout the lake, from onshore to 800 feet.
Information obtained on each species, for instance, walleye populations, is used to make decisions regarding quotas and seasons. GLIFWC staff cooperates with state and federal resource managers in both spring and fall walleye population surveys through assessment netting and electroshocking. Spring surveys using mark and recapture methods provide annual population estimates, and fall surveys estimate the young of the year. Routine assessments continue annually on the Lake Superior fishery and for other fish species, such as muskellunge, in inland lakes. Data is also recorded on wild rice, waterfowl, sharp-tailed grouse, bobcat, fisher, and deer. Many of GLIFWC's studies are done jointly with federal, state, or local agencies. Currently, GLIFWC is also studying forest undergrowth in tracts of the National Forest to determine the impact of logging on plants traditionally used by the Ojibwe for medicinal or ceremonial purposes. A recent memorandum of understanding signed by GLIFWC and the U.S. Forest Service recognizes treaty rights and tribal sovereignty and provides a vehicle for tribal input into forest management practices. An important aspect of work for GLIFWC biological staff is participation on committees at the state, federal, and international level. These are committees which recommend management policies.
We present a different voice, a sort of adding to the chorus of voices with environmental concerns, bringing a different perspective to resource management than science might provide, than state government might provide, than users might provide.
GLIFWC assessments also include activities related to environmental impacts on the resources. GLIFWC performs mercury level testing on walleye from lakes used by band members during spring spearfishing. Gathered information is released to member tribes via mercury level maps. Through a color code, the maps indicate mercury levels in specific lakes used by each member band.
We have programs aimed at controlling exotic or invasive species. They're non-native species that pose threats to the health of native fish, wildlife, wild plant populations.
GLIFWC's involvement in sea lamprey assessments, purple loosestrife eradication, assessment of the river ruff populations, and public education on the zebra mussel help protect species and habitat from potential damage. Another important aspect of resource conservation is enforcement. Tribal ordinances govern each off-reservation treaty season. These ordinances are enforced through GLIFWC's Enforcement Division, which employs more than 20 full-time certified conservation officers.
Each of the tribes as a sovereign has authority over their membership, but they don't have authority over another tribe's membership. And so in that regard, the commission is rather unique in that the tribes have delegated to us some of that sovereign power so that we can exercise enforcement authority over all tribal members throughout the entire ceded territory.
GLIFWC's conservation officers are stationed at satellite offices on member reservations and assigned to patrol off-reservation. They enforce off-reservation codes. Violations of tribal codes are cited into tribal courts for prosecution. GLIFWC officers engage in annual training for firearms and emergency operations, such as cold water rescue. Many GLIFWC officers are also certified safety instructors.
We have hunter's education, we have boating education, snowmobile education, ATV education, and that's just the beginning of it. We also do a real heavy part in education of the treaty rights themselves to the general public also, and to tribal members that don't have a very good insight or understanding of the treaty rights themselves.
GLIFWC's Division of Planning and Development looks at the needs of member tribes in enhancing and utilizing the resources available. It coordinates administration for Native American grants received for specific projects such as GIS mapping. It also oversees the GLIFWC Internet site, tribal youth education programs, public education programs, and internships. Marketing wild rice and fish from the Lake Superior Treaty commercial fishery have also been areas of work for planning and development staff. The Division of Intergovernmental Affairs assists member bands in addressing legislation and providing support in litigation which may affect treaty rights. This includes the large area of environmental concerns where tribes perceive a risk to the natural resource they harvest. For instance, the tribes believe a proposed copper-zinc mine near Crandon, Wisconsin, potentially threatens the groundwater in the vicinity of the Mole Lake Reservation. GLIFWC has been involved in the permitting process for the mine, as well as in research relating to the problems which could occur as a result of the mining operation. Similarly, staff members are involved in other areas of concern, such as with the International Joint Commission, which develops policy relating to the protection of the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Superior. The Public Information Division focuses on providing accurate information regarding off-reservation treaty seasons to the tribal public and the general public. Misinformation about Ojibwe treaty rights has led to considerable controversy since the 1983 Voight decision. The Public Information Office uses pamphlets, brochures, videos, and its quarterly newspaper, the Muzanayagan, to distribute information about the various treaty seasons and issues of concern to the tribes. Informational booths are also provided at sports shows, state fairs, education conferences, and other public events as a means of distributing information and talking with the general public. One of the most controversial treaty seasons has been the spring spearfishing netting season for walleye in Wisconsin and Minnesota. The lack of information regarding tribal quotas and the strict monitoring of the season has led to fears that walleye populations will be depleted. However, all tribal harvests, which use intensive traditional methods, are limited and very closely regulated. In Wisconsin, harvest levels show the impact of spring spearfishing to be small in comparison to the state angling sport harvest. The tribal harvest in Wisconsin has never exceeded 31,000 walleye. In comparison, the annual walleye harvest by anglers in the Wisconsin ceded territory is estimated in the hundreds of thousands. The season is managed systematically. By March 15th, the tribes each declare their quotas based on tribal need. The quotas are a percentage of the safe level of harvest. The safe level of harvest is itself a percentage of the lake's total allowable catch, or TAC. Therefore, the final quotas declared by tribes amount to only a small percentage of all the walleye in a lake and about 10% of the TAC. In Minnesota, the quota for Mille Lacs Lake is established as part of a 5-year management plan. In 1998, the first year for a treaty harvest in the lake, the 8 bands could take 40,000 pounds of walleye. In the next year, the quota increased to 55,000 pounds, with an annual increase of 15,000 through the 5 years. Then a second 5-year management plan will reestablish quotas. In order to spear or net fish, tribal members must pick up a daily permit at the tribal registration station located on each GLIFWC member reservation. That permit is good for one night only and indicates the lake and the bag limit for the night. If the lake has a quota of 100 walleye, for example, and 10 tribal fishers are going out, each will be allowed a bag limit of 10 fish. Tribal members are also governed by size limits. In Wisconsin, for example, only 2 walleye over 20 inches long can be taken per permit per night. This size limit, plus the spearer's knowledge of fish behavior, limits the take of spawning female walleye. These valued fish are usually larger and in deeper water than the others. About 85% of tribal harvest are male walleyes. Tribal spearfishers can only launch from and return to specified landings. These areas are manned by commission wardens and biological staff. Each spearer's catch is counted and measured prior to the person leaving the landing. Violations are cited on the spot. The intense monitoring of the spearfishing season allows the tribal members to practice an efficient, traditional harvest while protecting the natural resource. Similarly, the conservation code established by the Mille Lacs Band in Minnesota assures protection to the fishery in relation to spearing and netting activities.
Treaty seasons for the tribal members in Minnesota and then Wisconsin, the 1837 ceded territory, are defined through a general conservation code. This code has been approved by the courts. It's a very elaborate code, and particularly if you're interested in Minnesota, the code consists of about 114 pages.
A report entitled Casting Light Upon the Waters, compiled by Wisconsin federal and tribal biologists, clearly indicated that Chippewa spearing does not damage the resource. However, resource managers see that the combination of spearfishing, an intense sport angling season, and environmental degradation of fish habitat make it necessary to manage the fishery with care. The Ojibwe bands look forward to continued cooperative efforts to manage the resources on behalf of all who use and cherish the natural resources. Tribal resource managers recognize the need to enhance the resources as well. 9 of GLIFWC member bands run tribal fish hatcheries and stock both on and off reservation waters, including Lake Superior. GLIFWC and its member bands work with the Circle of Flight initiative to enhance wetlands throughout the ceded territory, providing improved habitat for waterfowl and other species. This includes a major effort at identifying old wild rice beds and reseeding efforts off-reservation. Ojibwe traditionally view life as a circle. That circle is inclusive of all people and species that share the earth. We must respect Mother Earth and all life forms upon which we as human beings are dependent. Aki, the earth, gives us great gifts of life, but we must keep water, her lifeblood, clean. So we must always be thoughtful and look forward with a vision as far-reaching as the eagle's eyes on behalf of Aki and 7 generations to come.